Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. We are now into May 2023. 1/3 of the year is done. April showers brings May flowers. What does May flowers bring? Well, more Sunday Perspective show for you. Sorry for the dad puns. Sorry for the dad jokes. Hope everybody's doing well. It was nice to take the last Sunday Perspective off. I had said at the beginning of the year we are going to try and get you as many shows as possible. I think last year we did like 102 or something like that. Somehow we did more than a couple of weeks. Our goal is to always get you 2 shows a week, Wednesday show and a Sunday show. But there are some months that have like an extra Sunday or an extra Wednesday in there. And so occasionally, just for our own sanity, we're gonna kind of keep it to probably 8 shows a week, 8 shows a month, typically. Occasionally there'll be a 9th. But, for me personally, I had some stuff I was traveling some. It was just gonna be tough to get that Sunday out. So thanks to everybody for allowing me to take a week off, or at least a weekend off from Sunday Perspectives. But good to be back. Good to be back talking about some things that are kind of a follow-up to both a conversation I had at KubeCon, but also kind of the hot topic du jour, and probably will be the hot topic for a while to come. Kind of, how AI is going to, impact the things that we do, especially around the cloud native space, around the IT space. A lot of conversation on the show floor at KubeCon in Amsterdam last week, talking about AI and what are people doing. I think the AI revolution, if you will, if you'll call it that, sort of AI 2023, whatever we're going to call it, kind of snuck up on KubeCon a little bit, because obviously when you're doing a big event, you've got to start planning it a long way in advance. Your call for papers are, usually 5-6 months in advance. You solidify the agenda and the schedule many months in advance. And I don't think there was necessarily a chance to get a bunch of AI related talks into place. Not to mention, for a lot of people, the technology is still relatively new. Not new in the sense of AI. That's been something that's been worked on for a while, but the ability for it to be so democratized and so available to so many people and usable by so many people has really just sort of exploded over the last, 4 or 5 months. And I say that just in the context of what's, now, what feels very, very visible and mainstream to a lot of people. So one of the things that I had a chance to do during the week of KubeCon was on the Cube. So John Furrier was hosting and came by and said, hey, could you grab some people? Let's do a segment on what we think might be, kind of the AI intersection with this cloud native space, both from an operations, DevOps, platform engineering, to a certain extent writing code perspective. And we were able to have about a 10-minute segment that was fine. It was kind of, the rapid pace of what goes on in the Cube. But I felt like maybe we didn't necessarily give it enough air to breathe. This is a space that's really, really new. So, a lot of the predictions, a lot of the what could be's, are still kind of shaking out. But I kind of wanted to use today's show to kind of walk through some of the conversations I had with people, some of the things I know people are experimenting with, some of the areas in which we'll probably start to see some low-hanging fruit types of engagements and interactions start to happen, and integrations and so forth. So I think I'm going to try and work on that list. I made a list of maybe about 8 or 9 things that I think will probably be focus areas by the time we get to Detroit, KubeCon, by the time we get to reInvent in November and December and in October and so forth. And we'll probably start to be pretty widely put in place by that time. So I will get to that after the break. Are you looking to stay ahead of the curve in the latest trends in enterprise tech? Look no further than the Breaking Analysis podcast with Dave Vellante. This data-driven program dives into the most important topics facing the enterprise tech industry today. With a data-first approach that leverages ETR's renowned surveys of IT decision-makers and insight from the Cube community, Breaking Analysis delivers in-depth research on the most important topics facing technologists and IT buyers. Whether you're a business leader, an IT professional, investor, or just an avid follower of the industry, this podcast is a must-listen. Just search Breaking Analysis Podcast wherever you get your podcast and tune in today to stay ahead of the game in enterprise tech. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to dig a little bit into some of the conversations and things that I've been talking to people about. And I heard conversations on the show floor and in various places around KubeCon, and not specific to KubeCon, but just that was the last chance we had to get a lot of people together, and a lot of smart people, a lot of ideas, a lot of differing viewpoints and so forth. And so I thought it'd be sort of an interesting kind of thing to kick off a list of areas in which I think we're going to see kind of these newer forms of AI, not necessarily all ChatGPT, but just newer forms of AI, more easily integrated, easy to understand, more democratized AI is going to hit sort of the cloud native space, both in the operations space as well as in where code's being written and so forth. So made sort of a list of these. I'm going to kind of walk through them. Would love to get people's feedback on areas in which they're seeing interesting AI integrations, interesting new tools and platforms, interesting use cases. I think this is a space that to a certain extent has people excited, quite excited about the possibilities, also has people somewhat concerned. AI has always been and has always had a kind of a reputation, or created a framework or a concern of, what happens with it, right? Does it replace jobs? Does it augment jobs? Does it improve jobs? All those sorts of things. So, anytime that there's an uncertainty about the human side of stuff, it always concerns some people. So would love to get people's feedback on this, whether this is useful or not, but also more importantly, just use cases, examples, tools, things that you've been working on. We'd love to hear about it. Love to share it with the community if you're willing to share it. Anyways, let me sort of start with the list. I'm going to start with sort of low-hanging fruit types of things first. I think we've already started to hear about companies that are building some models in which, at the most basic level, they're taking their own documentation, feeding them into some of these large language model tools, whether it's OpenAI or the open ones, whatever's out there. And they're starting to, allow people to query their documentation in certain ways. I think we're going to start to see some companies that will, or projects that will start to use these large language models to write their own documentation for them. So, we're going to see some documentation groups get augmented. Documentation groups always tend to be sort of understaffed. I think we'll start to see products and projects have their documentation written for them, but I think we'll also see documentation get fed into some of these large language models so that, either some best practices can come out of it. People can query it in different ways. People can use it as ways to validate maybe their configurations and so on and so forth. So I think having the documentation be more, tied into some of the AI systems is kind of an immediate type of first low-hanging fruit we're going to see a lot of. I think we're going to see some easier ability, especially in some of these complex systems, YAML and other various types of things, in which it'll be simpler to generate configurations, whether those are Terraform or Ansible or whatever they might be. There are so many out there. I think the ability to feed those types of things, whether they come from community projects or whether they come from other projects, the ability to kind of question or describe something in more layman's terms and English terms and kind of human readable types of ways, and generate configurations that come back from that, I think will be a next area that we'll see a lot of work around AI happening. Now, the interesting thing about this, and this will be kind of a underlying theme throughout, and something we'll cover in an upcoming show and so forth, is we still haven't reached a point in which you can feel 100% confident in some of these sort of computer-generated things, whether they are code that's generated, hey, build me an application to do something, or write me some code that does this, or in this case, build me a configuration file. So there's still going to be a certain amount of kind of expertise or experience that are going to have to go around reviewing and looking at these things and making sure that they're right. But I do think we will see a lot as far as moving the ball forward, maybe getting you started 60% of the way, 80% of the way. But I do think we're going to see some need for ongoing, just kind of making sure, because if somebody generates you a config file to go, build a system, build a box, an OS, or a network configuration, whatever that might be, if you get that thing wrong, even if it's one line that's wrong or a password that's wrong or something like that, you potentially make the system vulnerable if you're not doing some sort of checking against it. But I do think we will see quite a bit of that. I think we'll start to see, if you think about sort of when consulting organizations get involved or interaction with documentation, we're going to see some best practices become simpler to implement. Right? We've seen people for a long time build things like reference architectures, and those things often take quite a while. So a new release or a new bunch of releases come out the door, maybe a month later, 2 months later, 3 months later, new reference architecture will come out. I think we'll start to see those things start to come out more frequently. I think we'll start to see them become more interactive, and I think we'll start to see maybe less dependency, or the ability to scale how to get those best practices easier, right? So this is going to be an area in which, like, consulting organizations will probably have to figure out how to continue to provide value, because if they're providing best practices, a lot of times they sort of want to hold those back as being intellectual property. I think some of these large language models are going to be able to look at what's out there in the communities, especially in open source communities, be able to look at documentation, be able to start to connect the dots between those things. And so we'll start to see kind of best practices, reference architectures become easier to generate, easier to question, easier to say, hey, let me do some scenario planning against this. Like, oh, I like this best practice, but what if we were to distribute them across, different geographies? What happens? What changes in terms of best practices? Or, hey, we're looking to do this and we want high availability, but we also have certain cost constraints. What are some options that are available to us? And those are things that obviously can be put together today, but they oftentimes require quite a bit of expertise, localized expertise, various types of things. And so I think we'll start to see some models get built that will do that. And there's opportunities, I think, there to be disruptive. You may see some consulting organizations that build these types of things that are trying to disrupt other consulting models. One of the challenges of consulting is always manpower. It's not necessarily the most scalable business, because you're always having to find people. It's not always the most profitable business versus software. So I think there's opportunities for those types of interesting systems and intelligent systems to come along. I think we're obviously going to see quite a bit of this technology applied towards interactive support, whether this are bots that pop up on the website, chat bots, things that are agents that get deployed that proactively look at your system, look in your logs, look at it again, look at your configurations, and are doing more proactive types of things. And they may be notification types of systems that we see today. They may be things that you enable to take action on your behalf. We've seen some of these systems in the past, but again, I think as we start to see more of a corpus of the information being put into these systems starting to have some interesting front ends that allow us to do scenario planning, to ask about context, to ask what ifs. I think we'll start to see some interesting interactive support. I think we'll start to see some things happen that maybe remove the burden or reduce the burden of certain support systems are great during certain hours of the day in certain regions. But they're not always the same. So you get outside of 8 to 5, and maybe you're in a different time zone. I think we've all dealt with this. Maybe you're in the United States, and you have a problem late at night. Now you're dealing with a support center that is covering APAC, and maybe the one that you interact with doesn't the language that's being used is not the first language that aligns to your language. And again, this isn't US specific. You could be in Europe or APAC or South America or anywhere. I think the ability to normalize some of that so that you don't have, the best people are only in New York City, or they're only in, San Francisco, or they're only in, some parts of Eastern Europe or something. I think the ability to normalize that will also be a big part of the evolution of some of this interactive support. Now, the next one that came up, and this was an interesting topic that came up on an internal Slack channel that a lot of us frequent over the Software Defined Talk Slack channel. Somebody asked Brandon a question, and he said, hey, what's the difference between all this new AI stuff and things like ChatOps and other stuff, and what's already marketed in the, that's kind of out there in the market or marketed as AIOps, right? Is AI already part of what's going on here? And I think the reality is, up until recently, a lot of the quote unquote AI ops was really just statistical analysis that was built into systems. And that's great. It can be very, very helpful to look at, what's normal for your system. What are anomalies? Should those anomalies be red, yellow, or green in terms of should they be flagged? Should certain actions be taken? That will continue to happen. I think what we're going to see in the sort of evolution of AI ops, whatever name sort of emerges, will be much more interactive types of systems, things in which there can be much more of a human interaction, human-like interaction that goes on. And so that's a space that's already made quite a bit of progress around operations, whether this is, digging through your logs, digging through your your sort of troubleshooting mechanisms that are out there, your notifications, all those sort of things. But I think we're going to see, again, as more and more of the kind of context of systems gets put in place, we'll see that evolve as well. I think we'll start to see more sort of self-correcting and self-adjusting systems. And again, this is where we're going to have to do some hand-holding of, do I want the system to take care of this for me? We've seen some really basic things like this be really successful. Things like, vMotion, automatic vMotion back in the virtualization days. When things like that first came out, people were really excited about the idea of vMotion, but they didn't want to turn it on by default because they didn't necessarily trust the system. And then as they began to turn it on more and more, they began to trust its ability to deal with high availability and to deal with failover and to deal with different system situations. So I think we'll start to see that. Again, this is one of these things that people will initially not necessarily trust it. People will figure out ways to apply their expertise to it and have expertise, human expertise with human context and human experience kind of sitting there, similar to what we have today in self-driving cars. If you've ever driven in a self-driving cab, for example, obviously we haven't reached full self-driving, full autonomy, lots of discussion around that. But, oftentimes if you got in a car in San Francisco, I know I have in Pittsburgh before, where a lot of the Carnegie Mellon stuff was going on, there was a driver in the car with you as well. And they were kind of monitoring the system, and they had the ability to put their foot on the brake, just like when you have a driver's ed type of thing. So I think we're going to start to see some of that be necessary. I actually want to dive into that in a later call, or a later Sunday Perspective show we'll do later this month. But I think we'll start to see some of that. And I think it'll be interesting to sort of watch the evolution of what the human plus AI interaction looks like, especially with this new generation. The next thing I had on my list, and this is one that I wasn't totally sure if I should put on the list or not, and that's around sort of chaos engineering. So we've talked on the show many times about chaos engineering. Obviously, this was something that kind of became popularized with the tools that Netflix built. They used to call it the Simian Army. Basically, the ability to build out a system, have it in production, and then kind of unleash these things whose job is to go and do the equivalent of breaking your system, unplugging cables, and taking systems down just randomly, and using it to figure out how well have you built resiliency into your system. Have you built around potential failure scenarios and unexpected failure scenarios? It will be interesting to see whether there's anything from an AI perspective that can improve this, or if the nature of chaos engineering is such that maybe it really shouldn't apply because you need more chaoticness to it. You need less pattern recognition and less kind of expected behaviors, and you're really trying to create unexpected behaviors. So I put it down as something that maybe as chaos engineering becomes more mainstream, because I don't know it's completely mainstream yet, but can AI help out with some of these tools in terms of looking at the results of failure scenarios, building that back into the thing, trying to use it to train people about, how to interpret failure scenarios, and did the scenario fail the way it was expected? Did it create a new problem that wasn't there? So I think there may be some opportunities for it to improve around those types of things. I talked a little bit about the AIOps space. I think there will be, quite a bit that will happen around logging, log remediation, log interpretation, like what's going on. We already have lots of fantastic tools. We talk to the folks from Datadog all the time. There's lots of tools that look at logs and try and figure out what's going on, but they are trying to remediate an immediate thing. Is there more that could happen as we take our logs, which are oftentimes in text, but could be in lots of different formats, and dump them into these large language models and use the models to see repetitive kinds of problems over and over again, to help us build better documentation so that we're not trying to figure out what error code such and such means. It will kind of interpret those things for us. So I think there's going to be an intersection between kind of what is AIOps today, intelligent logging systems today, the ability to not be afraid to generate and consume large amounts and large volumes of those logs, because oftentimes it was too much. And then, the intelligence around what do these things mean? Are these patterns that are happening frequently? Are these things that are happening because of configuration errors? Are they happening because of system-wide failures? All sorts of things. I think there's lots of ability to build maybe greater context around that whole space. And I think as we start to maybe interact the systems between what's in documentation, how can we support them, how can we do automated support, lots of kind of overlapping Venn diagrams there that potentially get more interesting. And then the last thing on my list, and this is the thing that, beyond just the sort of ChatGPT stuff has really kind of gotten people interested, is, the ability for these systems to write code. And, how fast will they be able to get updated as new languages and new frameworks come out? So maybe you want the latest version of Rust, or you want, some new way of doing it in a serverless model or whatever it might be. We've seen some interesting stuff already. We've seen people, have applications get built, websites get built. It will be interesting to see how these new systems interact with CI and CD systems. It will be very interesting to see if we see the evolution of like pair programming, in which you're no longer pair programming with another developer. Maybe you're pair programming with one of these large language models, all those types of things. And there's lots and lots that could happen around the development space. Most of what I've seen from people that have been playing around with this stuff, whether it's Copilot or ChatGPT or, lots and lots of things, is, generally they feel pretty good about what's being written. They feel like it helps them accelerate their velocity. They do still feel like they provide a lot of value in the system because they have context around it. They're able to look at the code and figure out how sophisticated it is. But it will be interesting to, again, watch that space as well. And the last thing I really thought about was, kind of not, areas in which AI will come into, but really kind of scenarios that we need to think about. So as products or projects start to build some of these AI models in or around their products, a couple of questions came to mind. So the first is, who will build these models? We've seen for a long time that companies are hiring data scientists, but the data scientists tended to live around their data. Looking at how do we improve sales? How do we improve marketing? How do we improve efficiency of our supply chain? How do we, do better manufacturing or understand markets or weather patterns? Whatever the data scientists were focused on, they tended to be, data around the business. And then how do we use that to, improve or better understand a scenario? We've never really necessarily hired data scientists specifically like in IT or in IT operations, or even just in, the development teams to improve how fast they go. So, where will we be seeing the next generation of either data scientists or even sort of data scientist light, right? People that are, now kind of looking at, hey, how can I leverage these tools to improve my skill set, my resume, and so forth. So, who will build these models? Will they be sort of self-service models in which the end users are having to learn to build them? Are these things that different open source projects will build as being good community building blocks, and the community continues to build them, similar to what we've seen in, Ansible and Terraform and Chef and Puppet communities, in which lots of recipes and other things are built and then put back into the community. So be very, very interested to see, who ends up looking at building these models, and then, how is the iteration and improvement of those models done? The second question that I heard a lot, and this is sort of an ongoing question, I think we heard it more in Europe because of the privacy laws, but where will the data and the models reside, right? Do they have to live in the products? Do they have to live on premises? Where they live in the cloud, and how much locality will that matter? I guess it'll depend. So I think there's a lot of questions about where the models will live. Where does the data live that the models are interacting with? We've already seen some scenarios. I heard one interesting conversation of a product team. I believe it was for a vendor who their product team was trying to figure out, like, okay, given certain information that we have about use cases and usage patterns that our customers are using, what do we think the next set of feature requests are going to be? What do we think the next, problem space they're going to have? And they went ahead and put a bunch of this data, their own sort of, think of it as intellectual property. They put it into one of these like open AI type of models, in which once you put the data in, it sort of becomes part of the broader system. And they didn't realize until it was out there that they had, sort of exposed themselves to, putting their information out there. So it'll be very, very interesting to sort of watch and see, where the models are located, what systems people are putting models into. Do they continue to use the ones from the big established vendors or sort of up and coming vendors? Are they building their own based on open source? We've seen some interesting open source projects emerge. How will that sort of work? Then, the next thing I was sort of wondering was, we've seen over the last 10 or so years, the interaction between new stuff coming out. And again, we'll use OpenAI as an example of that, right? Sort of kind of an open model, somewhat open API, but kind of proprietary source of data, for-profit company. And now we're starting to see some open source alternatives to that, right? Different size data sets and making those things available. What will be the interaction between open source and sort of, either closed systems, proprietary systems, open source, open communities? Be very interested to sort of watch what those dynamics look like. Do they continue to look the way they do today, in which, the interaction between how projects are created, how communities and foundations are built around those things, what's openly shared, what's sort of kept to itself, or will there be very new dynamics that'll happen here? And I don't know that we totally know the answer to that, but it'll be interesting to see how it goes, because again, we may find that there are very different monetization models or community interaction models that happen. Because again, we're not just dealing with a piece of software, but we're dealing with large data sets, and where do those data sets reside? And, how do we build the models, and how do we iterate the models, and stuff that we talked about on a recent show, like with the folks at Microsoft about, who pays for all these systems that store data or run CI/CD pipelines and other stuff. And then the last thing is just, if you're new to this space, being able to figure out easily, like, what risks do I need to mitigate, right? How do I avoid doing that thing where those product managers didn't necessarily inherently think, oh, I shouldn't put that data out into this system? Or, somebody going, well, where do I have to have information reside, right? If it's a model, but it's not necessarily data, does that have to live in the country? What other sort of mistakes should you avoid? What are the first level things that you should do, you shouldn't do? I think we need to have more discussion about what that is, and those will be interesting things to watch. So anyways, that was kind of my list of both, areas that I think we'll see immediate near-term AI interaction being built into products, being available to people, communities starting to build, but also some questions to think about and ask in terms of, am I getting the most out of this? Am I making newbie mistakes? Who should we be looking to hire? What skills should we be looking to add and augment to our team? So lots of different interesting stuff out there. I think we're going to see the back half of this year. We're going to just continue to see sort of an explosion of interesting things interact with our space, not just for data scientists, but for everybody in operations, platform engineering, DevOps, application developers, the interaction between those things. So anyways, hope this was helpful. This was sort of me making a list of some stuff I'm hearing about already. Would love to, like I said at the top of the show, love to hear your feedback, love to hear the use cases you're running into, love to hear the tools that you're finding success or failures with, and help us start to build more institutional knowledge that we can, again, share back with the community, and hopefully you're willing to share with the community. So with that, we're going to wrap it up. Excited for May to be here. Weather's starting to get warmer, sun's staying up longer in the day. So lots of good stuff. Hope everybody's doing well. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for helping us grow the community. Thanks for telling a friend about the show. And with that, I'll wrap it up, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.